Awesome. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you could tune in this afternoon or perhaps watch this later. So I'm gonna ask if we can put on mute if you're not talking there. That would be helpful. I'm sure for all of us, what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now is heavy on our hearts. But for Leslie and I, were also planning a trip in January of 2024 that got canceled. And so it's been heavy on our minds as well. And we just wanted to have this opportunity to have a space to talk about it and think about it. And we got connected with Jer and Global Immersion. And we're just very excited that he's here and able to share with us today. So just real quick, little brief bio here, Jer, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. So Dr. Jer Swigert is the co-founder and executive director of Global Immersion and the co-author of Mending the Divides, Creating Love in a Conflicted World. And we're glad that you're here with us, Jer.
Thanks so much, AJ and Leslie. Thanks for hosting me, and for all of you who are carving out some time on a Sunday afternoon to think about these things. I'm grateful for it. One of the realities that I think we're up against right now, and that I will certainly inform the reflections that I want to bring to us this afternoon, is that what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine and Gaza in particular is not just another uptick in a regular pattern of violence in the Middle East. This is substantively different what's happening here, and so there's a different level of urgency. And so I'm appreciating now, I think this is my seventh opportunity to chat about this in a more public space with a broader audience. And what I'm noticing is that the pores of our souls are a bit more open maybe than ever before, and I think we're sensing that there's a deeper urgency. And so good for you for being here. My hope this afternoon is to help move us in the direction of a more holistic, pro-human understanding of what's going on, so that we can engage this as peacemakers. And the other thing that I'm finding, friends, is that what feels really critical in this moment in time is for spaces like these where we can ask questions imperfectly. I think part of the reason we are where we are as it relates to Israel and Palestine is that for years, many of us have been deeply troubled, confused, been asking big questions, but have been cautious in asking those questions. And so we become a bit constipated by our confusion, and that moves us into some indifference, or at least some apathy. This is a moment for us to ask questions imperfectly and to hold a space for that. And that's the only way we're gonna learn and then engage in this. And so a little bit about me, and then an analysis of what I think we're seeing right now. And then I want to open it up for you to wonder out loud, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. As Leslie was alluding to, as I entered in our work with Global Immersion, we form reconciling leaders and everyday peacemakers to mend divides. And so for the past 12 years, we've been forging communities of everyday peacemakers all over North America, specifically by raising the capacity of faith leaders to become conflict competent leaders who can then shape the transformation of their organizations into instruments of peace that participate in repair in your own cities. And one of the ways that we've done that over the last 12 years is by building delegations of faith leaders here in the United States, and then immersing with them into the radical center of conflict. We've done that in a couple of different places, Israel and Palestine being one of the most specific. There's a couple of convictions that really drive our work. Number one, peacemaking isn't an add-on to our faith, it's the essence of it. Number two, there's no corner in the cosmos where God is not restoratively at work. Number three, if you want to learn about peace, go to conflict, because it's the best classroom in the world. And if you want to learn about peacemaking, go learn from the peacemakers embedded in that conflict, because they're the best teachers in the world. And so those have been some of the convictions that have driven our work. As we build delegations, we immerse into the realities of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and we train with these women and men, some of the best peacemakers on the planet. And then they send us back home, and then Global Immersion does a series of integrative coaching to help integrate us as reconciling leaders into our own spaces. And so this is not transactional, programmatic. This is deeply relational work. And so what's happening right now is not just the stuff of theological exercise or geopolitical exercise. My friends are in the fray. They're in the trenches of this war right now, and the urgency is very, very high. I happened to be on the ground when this most recent horror began to unfold. We were just preparing our next delegation. I was going to show up a couple of days early to hang out with some of my friends over there, Israeli and Palestinian, just because I wanted to. It'd been a long time since I'd been on the ground, and I wanted to see them without a bunch of people with me. And so got to spend 2 full days celebrating birthdays and having some unique experiences with my colleagues over there. And then woke up the morning of the 7th at about 6:30 in the morning to the sound of rockets colliding with missiles in the air above us and air raid sirens. And then it kickstarted us into a 4 or 5 day period that was the environment of our training shifted substantially. And so I want to just share one story that then sets the foundation for the analysis that I want to offer. At about, I think, day 4, the violence was really beginning to crescendo. And part of my work at this point was to figure out how it was that I was going to evacuate my people from what had become a war zone. And once we had tickets in hand and we had contingency plans established, we were sitting on the rooftop of our hotel in the old city of Jerusalem, literally overlooking Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, the gold dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I had invited a Jewish rabbi friend from Jerusalem to come sit with my people. And we knew that we needed a deeper understanding, and we wanted to hear from him. And he taught us this concept called machloket, and which has become a central theme for me as I'm beginning to do this work of helping us grow a more holistic and pro-human understanding. The root of the term machloket means part or particle. And so that root is used in the word divide. It's also used in the word share, whereas the word shalom is the word for whole or wholeness. Machloket, defined loosely, it means righteous disagreement. And the point of machloket is I have a part, a perspective, and you have a part, a perspective. And when we come together, it's not reasonable for us to try to dominate one another with the superiority of our perspective. Rather, when we come together, we disagree for the sake of heaven, as they say. We engage in a process of righteous disagreement where we together begin to build a more holistic understanding, a better understanding. As he was teaching that concept, the air raid sirens began to blare and rockets and missiles were colliding above us again. And Jared, the Jewish rabbi, says, does this hotel have a bomb shelter? And we didn't, but we had a stairwell. So we're on the rooftop, so we're all sprinting for the bomb shelter. And Jared reaches for my hand and he says, hey, Jared, this is what happened when machloket breaks down. And then we made our way to the base of the stairwell where there were Israelis and Palestinians and internationals. And in that space, we discovered each other's dignity and humanity. We reached for each other's hands rather than power. We stepped into a more costly solidarity, recognized that we need each other. And that's when I began to understand, okay, part of the work for me upon return is to bring a more holistic, more pro-human, more beautiful understanding to what's happening so that we can stop reaching for power and start reaching for each other's hands. And so with that, let me offer a bit of a briefing on where we're at, and then open up for some questions. On October 7th, Al-Qassam soldiers representing Hamas attacked southern villages in Israel, kibbutzim, a music festival. I think we all watched this unfold and the horrors of it unfold. The death toll was over 1,200 when it was all said and done. 244 hostages were taken, and it was morally reprehensible, an act of terrorism. I want to say that my usage of the word terror or terrorism is I have issues. I critique the way in which globally, and especially in the West, the word terror and terrorism is almost unilaterally assigned to Muslims and Muslim men and Muslim fighters. But in this case, I would say that what transpired on October the 7th was an act of terror. It was, I would also suggest that it was both predicted, inevitable, and preventable. And so we'll get to that in just a second. It's being called the 9/11 of Israel. As many of you know now, this is the greatest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And it should absolutely break our hearts for our Jewish kin. And in the work that I've been doing with my Jewish kin around the United States, in my own city here, and around the world, I'm growing in my understanding of what October the 7th did to our Jewish kin, in that it awakened a societal level, generational, DNA level PTSD. And, you know, many of you know and understand this, that for thousands of years, the world has been trying to eradicate the planet from of the Jewish people. From the time of Esther through the Middle Ages to the programs of Europe of the early 20th century, including the horrors of the Holocaust, the world has been trying to erase the Jewish people, and in some moments have come very, very close to being successful at it. Children are taught at a very young age that the world will try again, that the responsibility of the emerging generations of our Jewish kin is to ensure that it never happens again. And so let me just share with you two quick stories. One, whenever I'm in Israel and Palestine, and especially with a delegation of leaders, I take them to a museum called Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, one of the most significant museums, I think, on the planet. And every time I'm there, there's a platoon of 15 to 16-year-old students, Jewish students, because as you may know, Israel is a mandatory militarized society, which means that everybody has to serve at least 2 years in the military. And then beyond that, if Israel is ever attacked, there's an obligation that you continue to serve as a reservist as long as you're able to fight. And so the militarization of young people in Israel, however, doesn't begin with basic training as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. It begins in the early years as they're socialized into that societal DNA level PTSD. And they're given a particular construction of who the Palestinian in particular is, under the guise of the world will try to eliminate us again, and it's your responsibility to ensure that it never happens again. As I walk through Yad Vashem, I watch platoons of kids, 15, 16, 17-year-old, in their khaki fatigues, make their way through this museum with me. And one of the messages of Yad Vashem is that the world tried to kill us, God abandoned us, and we survived. We're still here. And at the end of that tour, I watched their platoon leaders place assault rifles in the hands of teenagers and say, and now it's your duty to ensure that it never happens again. Fast forward the clock to when I was evacuating from Israel. I'm at the airport in Ben Gurion, which was target number one for Hamas. They knew that if they could neutralize the airport in Israel, they could neutralize the flow of reservists back into the country. Because remember, if Israel's attacked, your obligation is to stop whatever you're doing around the world and return home to defend your people. And I sat at baggage claim and I watched hundreds upon hundreds of young people get off airplanes with bags. They were greeted by the hugs of their mothers and the kisses of their fathers, and they were put into platoons of 20 and rushed to the southern border. It was now their turn because the world was trying to do it again. So I want us to, as we're thinking about what's happening here, I know that we're overwhelmed with the scale of violence as it's unfolding across the board over there. To become pro-human people is to understand that behind every act of violence, whether it's with the initiative or retaliation, there's a story of deep pain and violence, and it should absolutely break our hearts. Since October 7th and the atrocities that took place in southern Israel, and an average of 12,000 tons of bombs has been dropped on Gaza per week by the Israeli military. As of today, and like many of you, I'm keeping up to speed on what's happening real time in the Gaza. The current death toll is over 11,000 confirmed dead, and nearly 8,000 of them are women and children. Tens of thousands are wounded. 45% of housing has been damaged or destroyed in the Gaza. There have been 270 attacks on healthcare facilities, 21 out of 35 hospitals are out of service. 253 schools are destroyed, 71 mosques and 3 churches, and over 1 million folks have been forcibly displaced. And then dozens of villages, both in the Gaza and in the West Bank, have been forcibly depopulated. There's an expansion of the blockade on Gaza, which I'll talk about some of the realities of what the Gaza Strip is just in a moment. But to start here, the Gaza has been under a significant siege blockade for going on 17 years now. That means that there's a wall, or some would call it a security fence, around the Gaza Strip. There are a couple of checkpoints that give entrance into Egypt and into Israel. And that UNRWA, UNRWA, which was established in 1949, when the state of Israel was established in 1948, it displaced 750,000 Palestinians who had called Palestine home and had cultivated that place and built homes and villages in that place for thousands of years. 750,000 of them were displaced, and so the United Nations developed UNRWA to support Palestinian refugees. UNRWA's role, one of their primary roles as it relates to the Gaza right now, is to provide humanitarian support. They are the sole deliverer and provider of humanitarian support into the Gaza. Before October 7th, that looked like 200 trucks of humanitarian support a day, most of that coming in through the Rafah Gate, which is between Egypt and the Gaza. The humanitarian rights organizations and the United Nations have said that it takes 200 trucks of humanitarian support to simply keep Gaza alive. And so since this has begun on October 7th and following, water, gas, electricity, fuel, medical supplies have all been cut off. Basic necessities of life are being withheld from 2.3 million people. Right now in the Gaza, 99.9% of the water is non-potable unless it's treated, requiring fuel and electricity to do so. As I mentioned, hospitals are out of fuel, clean water, electricity, medical supplies, and as we're watching right now, real-time, hospitals are becoming unrefrigerated morgues. And so it's dire what's happening right now in Gaza. It is a human catastrophe at an unthinkable level. Let me share a couple of words on Gaza, just to make sure that we understand what we're talking about here. Gaza is a 25-mile by 7-mile rectangle that's been one of the most continuously inhabited places on planet Earth. In 1948, when Israel was established, many heralded it as a miracle, but it was experienced as a nightmare by our Palestinian kin. As I mentioned, there was a myth that existed in 1948 connected to the horrors and the aftermath of the Holocaust, as well as some work that was happening during World War I. If you Google a document called the Balfour Declaration, you'll learn of a theological and economic collaboration that was designed. They were designing a vision that would get the world's Jewish population back connected into the land of their ancestors. So that was happening in 1917 or so. 1948, 6 million Jews were killed. The world tried to eliminate them and were almost successful. And so as an international community, there was a sense of deep remorse and residual guilt. And it felt like a solution was the Jewish people needed a nation where they could have their own government, where they had self-determination, where they could defend themselves. And while there were many different options on the planet that were put forward, there was a desire to see them populate the land of their ancestors. The myth that was used in that time, it was essentially a global PR campaign, is that Israel, the Jewish people, were being given a land without a people for a people without a land. The problem is that only half of that is true. The people without a land was true, but the land without people couldn't have been further from the truth, as nearly 1 million Palestinians resided in that space. And so in 1948, when traumatized Western European Jews who had survived the Holocaust arrived on the shores of their ancestral space, they did so with guns and the backing of the international community and displaced 750,000 Palestinians. That was referred to as the Nakba by our Palestinian kin, the catastrophe. So where one would herald 1948 as a miracle, the community that suffered the most would call it the Nakba, or the catastrophe. 750,000 were forcibly displaced. 500 villages were massacred, and Gaza's population tripled from 80,000 to 250,000. So in 1948, we begin to see a refugee crisis in the Gaza region. Hamas was initially founded as an Islamist organization providing humanitarian support for the refugees in Gaza. I think that's important to understand, is that oftentimes these words that have been painted in a particular way have a story too. And so Hamas was an Islamist organization providing humanitarian support for that refugee community that lived in Gaza. Throughout time, the way in which the occupation has interacted with and has established structural violence around the Palestinian people in the Gaza and in the West Bank, the structural violence looking like walls, looking like military presence, looking like blockades and restrictions on movement and food and trade and things like this. Of course, the Palestinian people feeling the threat of it. There have been moments where the Palestinian people have engaged in uprisings. The word for that over there is intifada. And in 1987 to 1993, there was the first intifada, which began as a non-violent uprising and then transitioned into a more violent approach. But this was the Palestinian people saying, we've been living under the boot of an occupation and the international community doesn't care. We've been trying to tell the story. Nobody's listening. So now we'll take matters into our own hands. In that time, it's important to understand that the ideology of Hamas became extreme, and their posture shifted to armed resistance against Israel. This is when they formed their charter, where they declare their intent to rid the world of Israel. So that's important for us to hold on to here, that this is real. In 1997, the United States and the EU, among others, deemed Hamas a terrorist organization for that reason. I think it's also helpful to understand that with Israel's support, Hamas grew to become the governing body of Gaza in 2006. And so the Gaza at this point, 25-mile by 6-mile rectangle that's enclosed by land and is blockaded by land, sea, and air. That means there's no freedom of movement. There's no freedom of trade. There's that parcel of land. And then there's the West Bank. If you look on the map, that's kind of the eastern side of Israel proper that borders up against the country of Jordan. That's called the West Bank. At that, before 2006, the PLO and specifically Fatah was the governing body of the Palestinian people. It became clear that it's hard for one governing body to rule over discontiguous portions of land. And so with the support of Israel, Hamas actually comes into power and is voted into the political body that rules Gaza, while Fatah stays the Palestinian governing body that rules over the Palestinian people. Here's what that did. That divided the Palestinian people. It weakened the support for Fatah, which is the governing body again in West Bank. And then it gave Israel the opportunity to message that if a terrorist organization leads a failed mini-state, that being Gaza, we can't negotiate peace. Who is our dialogue partner? And then shortly thereafter that, in 2006, the security fence was really reinforced and the blockade was established to really ensure full control over the Gaza Strip. Around that same time, this was 2004, 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced that Israel would pull its 8,000 settlers and military presence out of Gaza. And so the settler strategy has been designed by the Israeli government to ensure that even the places distinguished the Palestinian territories have a growing community of Israeli Jews. There are two groups of people that tend to make up settlers. The first would be the ideological extremes. These are the people who are there provocatively so, and they are there to occupy and claim as much of that land. They'd like to see Palestinians completely dispossessed of the land. The second group are economically disadvantaged folk. These are people who can find cheaper housing and settlements than they can, say, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And so that's a way that the populations can swell within these settlements. Well, in the early 2000s, about 8,000 settlers were in the Gaza, and this is a moment where there's a little bit more freedom of flow. The structural violence in terms of walls and fences wasn't quite so reinforced. But in 2004, 2005, Ariel Sharon made the unilateral decision to remove these settlers from the Gaza Strip as well as the military presence. That was perplexing to both Israeli society. They're like, what do we get for this? And the Palestinian society saying, what is actually at play here? Something's going on. When that decision was made, there was an alignment called the Quartet. This was the United States, the EU, the UN, and Russia. They came together to build an analysis for what would happen the day after Israel disengaged from Gaza. They wanted to know, would the Gaza Strip become a thriving society, or would it cascade into complete destitution? The role of the quartet was to try to work with Israel in ways that would promote the former rather than the latter. So they made three recommendations. Number one, in order for Gaza to become a thriving society, there would need to be the free flow of people and goods between Gaza, Egypt, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. So somehow people and goods, trade would have to be established there. Number two, Gaza would have to have the opportunity to reopen their airport and their seaport. They would need to be able to move and have those ports of trade. Number three, Gaza would have to be given the opportunity to drill fuel, gas. And so there's a huge, not surprisingly, a huge fuel reserve under Gaza. And so the recommendation was they have to be able to drill that, access it, and export it if Gaza is to become a thriving society. The Quartet and Israel together agreed that if these agreements were made and never realized, everyone, and this is including Israel's intelligence wing, Shin Bet, everyone agreed that we'd eventually see exactly what we're seeing today. So in 2004, 2005, Ariel Sharon does pull out his settlers and military presence. These agreements are made, but they're never realized. Instead, the blockade became more severe on Gaza to the point at which Israel understands to the calorie how many resources need to be allowed into Gaza in order for people to survive, not thrive, survive. Since then, Gaza has become what many are calling the largest open air prison on the planet, or what our Palestinian kin are calling the largest concentration camp on the globe. Get this stat. This is really important for us. Humanitarian rights and aid organizations are unanimous in saying that before October 7th, 800,000 children were in need of urgent mental health intervention. So before this most recent crisis, 800,000 kids needed intervention, mental health intervention desperately. As I mentioned, Gaza has come under complete blockade by land, air, and sea for 16 years. And I want to just say that those that were watching participate in the heinous attacks of October the 7th, the Al-Qassam Brigade, the soldiers, their average age is 17 to 23 years old. Many of them in 2014 were the kids that were pulling themselves out of the rubble, having watched their moms and their dads and their brothers and their sisters die. We're now watching a new generation of child pull themselves out of the rubble, having experienced unthinkable trauma. And the question is, where are the supplies? Where is the resourcing to rescue these kids who will be fueled for revenge because Al-Qassam and extremist ideologies, they want to weaponize these kids as the next generation of Al-Qassam fighters. But I want you to know as well that there are untold number of peacemakers in Gaza and West Bank who are fighting tirelessly to get access to these kids, to participate in their healing, and to take them on a journey from revenge to reconciliation. So I want to say that what we're seeing today in light of this larger story and the context, and this is what's important for us, I think, as peacemakers, people who are trying to understand what's happening, to understand the context is not to condone what happened on October 7th or Israel's retaliation. But it's very important for us to understand that when you watch violence, there is a story, usually of deep pain, that lives behind it. I would argue that the real intelligence failure on October 7th is that everybody knew that this was inevitable, and no one took the steps to prevent it, even though we all had the tools to do so. That's the pain and the urgency and the sorrow that fuels my work. Let me offer a little bit around who's responding and how right now, and then I wonder what you're wondering. Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, both publicly and in leaked footage, is drawing the equivalency of the eradicating of Hamas and erasing the Palestinian people. And so there is, in many ways, Netanyahu is being seen right now as living some of what he's dreamt of for a very, very long time, and why he's fought so hard to hold on to power. He's saying things like, we need to prepare for a long, protracted war with generational implications. He's likening what's happening here to 1 Samuel 15 and the genocide of the Amalekites. So I think it's very important to understand that Israel is not a sacred spiritual society. There definitely is a religious contingent of Israeli society, but by and large, it's wildly secular. Pay attention then to the ways in which their sacred texts are being used to justify violence, and recognize in us our own propensity to do the same. I can think of a dozen stories in my lifetime when prominent US politicians have called upon scripture to declare that our itch for revenge is endorsed by God. So I can watch Netanyahu do this and I can critique it, but I can't critique it without also understanding that he's just simply following our playbook because it's really worked for us. On that point, Netanyahu has said very publicly that he will take no moral critique from anybody. And then it's important for us to understand that he then looks into the camera and says, because the international community did not stop the United States when it engaged in its campaign in Iraq. And it did not stop the United States when it engaged in its campaign in Afghanistan. These are not my words. These are Netanyahu's words. Humanitarian rights organizations and the United Nations are agreed that our two campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan led to the loss of between 4 and 5 million lives. So Netanyahu, he's saying, yeah, so 11,000 people, we've been targeting Hamas targets. 11,000 people have died. That's because Hamas uses civilians as human shields, but we will take no moral critique because it is nothing compared to what the United States has done in full view of everyone. I just think it's important to understand that Israel over time, is including the ways in which they've established an occupation, they continue to point to the United States and they keep saying, we're just simply following your playbook because you engaged a genocide of your indigenous people and caged those who were left, and look, now they're quiet. Or you built an entire economy on the backs of enslaved Black people and it worked. We're simply following your playbook, so we'll take no moral critique from you. Hard pill to swallow, but I think one worth noting here. What's been the US-American response? Right away, off the bat, early October, Biden says Israel has the right to defend itself. Secretary Blinken promises to defend Israel as long as America exists. Shortly into this violence, the United States, along with 14 island countries, vetoed a UN Security Council resolution for a humanitarian pause as millions suffered. Shortly thereafter, we collaborated with Qatar to get 52 trucks into the Gaza. Now, a couple thoughts on that. Israel has since said that the only reason they opened the Rafah gate for 52 trucks of supplies is because of the pressure from the United States. And the only reason that the United States stepped up their pressure is because people were melting the phone lines in Washington, D.C. So it's actually an example of what happens when we advocate by simply calling our member of Congress and demanding a ceasefire, an increase in humanitarian support, releasing of hostages, things like this. So it actually does matter. Now, I'm going to come back to that because something unique is happening right now as well. So we collaborated with Qatar to get to pressure Israel to allow 52 trucks of humanitarian support in. It takes 200 trucks a day before October 7th to ensure that Gazans had what they needed to survive, again, not to thrive. It's important to note that the humanitarian supplies in those 200 trucks are the 52 that were allowed on that day, or the word is right now between 30 and 35 trucks of humanitarian support are trickling into the Gaza on a daily basis. All of those supplies come from UNRWA, UNRWA, which stands for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Again, this was the UN agency that was established in 1949 with the sole purpose of supporting Palestinian refugees. So all of the supplies that you're hearing that are going into Gaza are not coming from Israel, and they're not coming from the United States directly. They're coming from the donations of United Nations member states. Who make contributions on an annual basis to UNRWA to provide supplies to run schools and hospitals in the Gaza and the West Bank. So that's where those supplies are coming from. The majority of them are coming in through the Rafah gate between Egypt and Gaza. Right now, it's important to note that UNRWA is understood as the last remaining lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza. If UNRWA gets defunded, it was being threatened of being defunded. As a matter of fact, during the Trump administration, we did stop funding UNRWA. And luckily, the rest of the United Nations stepped in and filled the gap. If UNRWA gets defunded for whatever reason, nobody knows how folks in the Gaza will survive. A couple other thoughts about the United States and our response. Maybe you saw this. There's a State Department employee named Josh Paul. His job has been to assess how the weapons that we export into the world are used to try to ensure that that the weapons that we export aren't used in war crimes. He resigned within 10 days of this horror in Israel and Gaza. He resigned, and he said, quote, "The Biden administration's blind support for one side was leading to policy decisions that were short-sighted, destructive, unjust, and contradictory to the very values we publicly espouse." So he couldn't, with integrity, maintain his job because he understood that our sales of arms were going to destroy the lives of lots and lots of people in Palestine. Shortly thereafter, Biden pledged $14.3 billion of support in Israel, which is currently being paused by Congress, which is also notable. There's something about our collective advocacy that is causing our members of Congress at last to put a pause on some of this. It's also important to note that of that $14.3 billion, the package would almost, this is a quote, entirely go toward defense contracts and facilitating the transfer of weapons and ammunition to Israel from U.S. stockpiles. So again, this is not an opinion. This is a verifiable fact that the over 25,000 tons of bombs that have dropped on our Palestinian kin in Gaza say "Made in the USA" on them. So we are intimately involved in this crisis. November 10th, something very significant happened. 100 congressional staffers walked out of their offices because their phone lines are melting and their representatives are not listening. So in an unprecedented move, 100 staffers amassed on the Capitol steps and declared to the world, the United States is melting our phones and our members of Congress aren't listening. What we're beginning to see is a slight shift in posture. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. There are three things that are fueling U.S. American engagement in this. One, geopolitics. For the United States, many would argue that it's never really been about Israel, and it's certainly never really been about the Palestinians. It's mostly been about fuel, access and control of fuel. And so Israel is a strategic access, provides strategic access for us in a way that is actually quite self-serving to us and our general interests geopolitically. Our posture is that we stand with our allies, and in this case, in that region, Israel is our ally. It's also important, though, to note that it's not solely about fuel geopolitically. Right now, the lines are being drawn in terms of global power. So essentially right now, the United States is fighting proxy wars, right? So you've got Russia and Ukraine. And so we're with Ukraine in that proxy war against Russia. You've got Iran and Israel. And so we're fighting Iran in a proxy war with Israel. So we have to support Israel here. And now what we're beginning to see is China posture itself in some ways that would indicate that they're about to make some power grabs. It wouldn't be surprising to many geopolitical analysts to see China invade Taiwan soon, because China understands that the United States cannot fight three proxy wars at the same time. And so what we need right now, and part of the reason it's suggested, part of the reason behind our adamant support for Israel is we need Ukraine to fight Russia. We need Israel to fight Iran, because otherwise we're going to be spread far too thin. So geopolitics are a factor. Electoral politics are a factor. You can imagine that there are calculations being made among the Biden administration with a 2024 election season coming up. Right now, this is no surprise that Biden is really struggling with his own progressive wing. The hyper-progressive Democrat is problematic to Biden. Yet, the play is they're going to show up because the progressive wing they're going to do whatever they need to do to block a Republican, especially if it's Trump, from getting access to the White House. So that's a speculation. Number two, there's speculation that he's trying to shore up his own donor base with more moderate progressives who are pro-Israel, not pro-Netanyahu, but pro-Israel in a more liberal sense. And then three, it's suggested that he's actually right now appealing to persuadables. And the persuadables in our electoral field tend to be evangelical Christians who are pro-Israel in an uncritical sense. So there's jockeying going on. There are plays being made geopolitically and from an electoral politics perspective that have a 2024 grasp of power probably in play here. Lastly, let's talk about Christians and American Christians. There's a lot behind a Western Christian fuel behind a pro-Israel sentiment. First, you have dispensational or rapture theology, this notion that the world is all going to burn, but before it does, Jesus is going to come back and get us, those who call on the name of Jesus, out of here before the pain really resides, and then Jesus will set up his throne and sit enthroned here. And so there's this, which, by the way, is that dispensationalism is 100-year-old theology that would have been completely heretical to the original movement, and but really drives much of evangelical in particular, but Western Christian support for Israel. This notion that as soon as Israel can be a ethnically pure nation state, then we can bulldoze the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, and erect the third temple. And as soon as that happens, well, then Jesus is going to come back and sit enthroned. So ultimately, what lies behind dispensational or rapture theology for many Western Christians is the misnomer that we can expedite the return of Jesus. That once the third temple is there, Jesus will in fact come back, and we're okay with whatever violence it takes, because we also have a theology that constructs a God for us who endorses violence to achieve what suits us the best. And so lots of problems with that theology that's probably worth several more Zoom conversations. Two of which I want to point out. Number one, I think it's a miss that Jesus sits enthroned as king of the cosmos right now. It doesn't need us to build a building for him. And secondly, it's wild that we would imagine that we can expedite the return of Jesus with violence as though God is honored by our violence, our endorsement of it. So that's a lot of the theological juice, and in a very simplistic way, of what lies behind a Western Christian understanding of this. What's missing here from a Christian perspective? In my view, what's missing is Jesus. Many of us have been socialized into a Western Christianity and a view of Israel that is established on what I would critique as a very thin Sunday school understanding of Israel and what God is up to on the planet. We sing songs like Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and therefore watch what's happening over in Israel and Gaza right now, and say to ourselves, well, isn't this kind of the way that it's always been? What we miss, in my view, is that Jesus is the exact representation of what God is like. And the God that we discovered in Jesus is an enemy-loving, cross-wearing God rather than cross-wielding God. So as Jesus people, as Christians in the West, rather than building our geopolitical understanding of this on a thin Old Testament theology, I think we need to establish a more robust theology around Jesus, who was the only one who ever really took us beyond neighbor love to enemy love, and invites us into a costly solidarity that probably critiques a truthless Christianity that is not good news to way too many people. And so we can talk about that a little bit more in a second. So on October 7th, I think we saw what happens when untended trauma collides with unchecked power. I think we saw what happens when ignored suffering generates ideologies that manifest in violence. I think we saw what happens when we reach for power rather than the hands of one another. And I think we saw what happens when our preference for power finds a theology that ignores Jesus and endorses violence. Let me pause there. Whew, that's a lot. Good thing it's recorded, right? Let me pause there, and I wonder what you're wondering. And again, please feel free to ask your questions imperfectly so we can just talk and hear one another out. So I don't know if you want to use the raise hand feature, or AJ or Leslie, who wants to kind of facilitate this, but let's ask some questions. I see you, Dave.
Yes, Chair. That was great. I really appreciated your perspective on everything. What I haven't heard much about is your discussions with Israelis and Palestinians, and have you found it possible to find common ground and get them to agree that it's worthwhile to work with each other and build a peaceful area for everyone in the Holy Land?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, if I'm not over there with delegations of U.S. American leaders training in the way of peacemaking, I'm sitting around tables with Palestinians and Israelis who are trying to figure out what it means to create the hopeful alternative to the structural violence and the hate that I think has really ruled the space for a long time. I don't imagine there are two things that I think really get in the way. The presence of structural violence in the place actually prohibits people from actually meeting one another. So many Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza, the only human interactions they have with Israelis are in very traumatic moments, whether it's a siege of a home or it's at a checkpoint or whatever it is, where they're encountering one another in a distrustful moment of violence. So we have to figure out, how do you remove the barriers of human interaction? And there are all sorts of organizations. I just did a live conversation, for an example, with the Parents Circle, which is a community of about 700 families, Israeli and Palestinians, and their common denominator is bereavement. They've all lost someone to the conflict, and they're finding themselves on a pathway from revenge to reconciliation, and are co-creating all sorts of experiments to transcend the structural violence to actually find each other's humanity and build a more costly solidarity. So we have to address the structural violence that's inhibiting people from actually seeing one another. Number two, I'll just share this brief story. When I was there last time, I squatted down next to a wall in the old city of Jerusalem, next to this very, very seasoned tiny Palestinian older woman who was selling grape leaves. And she saw that I wasn't doing well. And so in broken English, she asked me why I was there. And I told her what my work was, that my work was involved in peacemaking and conflict transformation. And she looked at me and she said, here, men make war and women make peace. And then I found myself around the table with Hadassah Froman, who's the widow of one of the most prominent peacemaking rabbis, the late Menachem Froman. And sitting around the table with her, she said, and this was a day later, she said, here, we've tried our hand for 75 years at male forms of peacemaking, peace through violence, and it's not working. And she said, perhaps it's time for the more feminine approaches of peacemaking to take the lead. The kinds of peacemaking that always center relationships, that usually featured shared tables, where there's solidarity in grief and compassion, where there's a deeper sense of listening to one another. So I think that's one of the great barriers and boundaries, is that the wrong people are sitting in the places of power and are using, I think, the wrong methods to move us toward peace. I think we probably need to change the game, which probably looks like people like me getting out of my seat and making sure that the right women are stepping into those spaces with us. So I think the solutions to what have plagued both of their peoples have been germinating in the souls of the women for a long time. We just haven't amplified it. We haven't sat close enough to them to listen and to actually release them to lead the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know. Oh.
Yeah, Barb, go for it. I hear you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your very thorough presentation. I understand the history of this conflict, but I have always wondered why, when the United Nations provided in 1948 this land for Israel,
yeah,
rightly so, I think, why they left that little strip of Gaza under Palestinian control. Why didn't those people move to the West Bank?
Yeah, I think it's a common question, like, why, if things are as hard or besieged as they are, why don't people just leave? And I think that's a Western understanding of land and lineage and home and things like this. The people of Gaza have called that place home for thousands of years. Their families have been there fishing those waters, farming those farms for thousands and thousands of years. And so to stay is actually to engage in an act of resistance. You make it uncomfortable for me. My friend Daoud Nasser of Tent of Nations, which is a hilltop organic farm surrounded by 5 Israeli settlements. They have papers on their land that go all the way back to the Ottoman Empire. They've been offered millions upon millions upon millions of dollars for their land. And he says, how can I sell the land when the land is my mother? And so I think their relationship to identity and home is different, fundamentally different than mine, for sure. I just relocated my family from Bend, Oregon to Spokane, Washington. And I don't have a sense of connection to my homeland, which means I can just do this. I think number 2, with that level of refugee resettlement into that space, there was a very fast and firm set of controls put over that area that made it very, very hard for people to move, for them to leave. And so I think you put those 2 factors together, and now you have a wall that is established around that piece of land where people can't leave. Fundamentally are disallowed from moving out of that space, making it what many would refer to as the largest open air prison in the world. So yeah, I think that probably has a lot to do with why people haven't left or won't leave.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question. Would you agree that the aggressiveness of Israel in response to October 7th is based primarily on Netanyahu's political career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. I think we've seen Netanyahu position himself anytime his power is being threatened. And you can track this. There's receipts for all of this. Anytime his power is being threatened, he'll engage in some kind of act of provocation because fear controls people really well. And people know that Netanyahu is really good when it comes to defense and expansion of settlements. And so, so there's a history of that. I think, secondly, and I think this is similar to what we're seeing play out in our own country right now. That Netanyahu also knows that when he's displaced from power, he'll go to prison, and that's not a new thing in Israel. The last 2, maybe 3 prime ministers went to prison after their tenure concluded. So many of us watch what's happening in the United States, and Trump's indictments and this or that, and we're like, we can't, like, this is happening in America, and the rest of the world's like, yeah, welcome to like the rest of our existence. Our political leaders are not people of virtue. They're not people of high character. These are people who make very clear calculations to hold on to power as long as they possibly can. So yes, I think that there is, I would be in agreement with the assessment that this is the moment that Netanyahu has been waiting for. I'm not comfortable with some of the conspiracy theories around who knew what, and was this, I'm not even sure that's helpful to get into. But yeah, I mean, when you look at Netanyahu's leaked and public presence, there is no reading between the lines in terms of what his desire is. And now the last thing I'll say to that is, it is of note that up until October the 6th, hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens were flooding the streets in a protest to Netanyahu's leadership. And because larger Israeli society actually is awake to the notion that Netanyahu's leadership is not good for Israel. They all know it's not good for Palestine, but they're now recognizing Netanyahu's leadership is not making it safe for us. And that's largely true. I find it ironic, and this is important for us to understand, that one of the leverage points is that many of the protesters were saying, because remember, this is an obligatory reservist community. If Israel's attacked, reservists are obligated to come back and fight. One of the levers of leverage that the protest movement was preparing to pull was, if Israel's attacked and Netanyahu's in power, we won't show up and serve. That was happening in Tel Aviv on October the 6th. And then on October the 7th, lo and behold, Israel was attacked, and many of those protesters went home and got their khakis on and drove down to the southern border, which simply says trauma is stronger than activism. So it's important for us to deal with the trauma, because when the catastrophe begins, we will live fueled by the trauma rather than our idealism. And I think we're seeing that in society right now.
Wow.
Dave, let's hold off for a quick second. I want to see if there's anybody else that has a question before I double dip back to you. And even feel free to disagree and such. Yeah, go ahead.
So, you said that all the young people in Israel have to go into the army, but that's not true of the ultra-Orthodox. They've got an exemption, right?
True,
And
which is
their percentage of the population is growing because they have more children. So I was just wondering, with your talking to Israelis, it seems like, and they're the ones who are so active in Netanyahu's government and are so aggressive in their foreign policy and stuff, and yet they're not sharing the pain of actually having people fight. So is there any sense that this is bringing that whole issue to a head?
Yeah, Amy, such a good point. Thank you for bringing it to the table. Yes, so the Hasidic community, the ultra-Orthodox religious community, the agreement was made in 1948 that there would be a community of people who would be subsidized by the government to study the scriptures and have children. And with the understanding that those children would never have to serve in the military. Now, to Amy's point, and this is so spot on, that community has grown exponentially, not only numerically, but in power. That is the community, one of the major communities that Netanyahu has now, if you look at the last 10 to 12 years, Netanyahu has been very cautious in forming any kind of alliance there, because the public perception is that that's an injustice, because the public was watching the Hasidic community grow in influence, but not have to put their children's lives at stake. And now you've seen Netanyahu has actually established coalitions with the most rightist and even religious groups like the Hasidics. And the community isn't, the Israeli society by and large is in an uproar about it. So these people wage inordinate amount of power, and many of it, I would argue that much of it is an extremist theological ideology that is that would prefer an ethnically pure nation state of Israel, based on the tenets, many of the tenets, honestly, of Judaism that Jesus had some pretty strong words against. We're seeing that actually form much of Netanyahu's policy and posture and practice. So yeah, it's wildly provocative and disruptive within Israeli society right now.
Can I jump in with a question?
I have one.
Hold on.
Sorry. Am I on?
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And dealing with the trauma right now, my imperfect question, and it's very imperfect. There are a lot of different ways to ask this question, but the simplest way to ask it is, can we ever move toward where you want us to go, either with United States public policy or through the UN or wherever? Is there any way to begin moving in that direction, as long as Hamas remains in power?
Yeah, good question.
In other words, does Hamas really have to be destroyed first?
Yeah. I mean, the world, that's a great question. Thank you. Why don't you pause, or why don't you mute your
I'm sorry.
see if you can mute your computer, so because we're hearing an echo.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
You're all right. There you go. So the world that I and my organization are dreaming of is one in which none of us are led by ideologies like Hamas and ideologies like what we're seeing right now in the Israeli Knesset. And so if Hamas, by the way, you can't kill an ideology by eliminating people. I mean, let's just take our own example of our desire in the early 2000s to eradicate Iraq from Saddam Hussein, and how we engaged that, and what it led to was not the eradication of an ideology. It created a vacuum in which ISIS then emerged. Or you take a look at what's happened in Afghanistan, and it created a vacuum in which now the Taliban is back in power. Right. So the notion that we can eradicate a disfavorable ideology through violence and through killing people, it doesn't eradicate it, it entrenches it, and it finds new people, new bodies, new manifestations of it. And so the question then becomes like, and I would argue that let's imagine that Hamas ideology disappears. What's problematic is that the ideology that informs Netanyahu, the ideology that informs US American engagement, they're still present. And I want to suggest that as Western folk and as Western Christians, our proximity to power shapes the way that we view this, and it creates all sorts of false binaries, like Hamas is bad, dark, evil, Israel and Knesset and Netanyahu are like light, good, and it's like this fight versus good and evil. And in fact, it's a disproportionate fight against two really forms of evil. Neither of them are righteous, and our fuel behind it is not righteous either. And so I think we need to have some different conversations if we're gonna move to the world that at least I'm dreaming of, and that many that I'm of my colleagues around the planet are dreaming of. We have to actually move beyond the false binaries of Hamas is wrong, Israel is right, and we need to actually build a new imagination, which begins with understanding where does Hamas ideology come from? Because again, an ideology that manifests in violence has its roots in pain, in violence being done to them. People are not sitting down and working on understanding that. Israel's trauma. I think we all nod at the Holocaust and what the Holocaust has done, but like our unequivocal support of Israel is not good for Israel. We are not a part of healing their trauma. We're a part of exacerbating it. We're funding a trauma-informed response rather than working with them and addressing their own collective trauma. So I think we keep playing the same game, hoping that suddenly evil will be eradicated. No, when you try to crush evil, oftentimes whoever wins just becomes the new evil with bigger guns. There's a different way in which we need to figure out how to actually approach one another. And I think that part of it, and this may sound simplistic, but I'd like the world to fund it. I'd like the world to fund organizations that are teaching people how to reach for one another's hands rather than power. Like billions of dollars is being invested in eradicating ideologies through violence, and it historically has never worked. At what point do we collectively start investing in peace? And the organizations that are actually training the people and the leaders and the organizations to run toward the crises with the tools to heal rather than to win. So I think we fundamentally need to think differently. Bad crushing evil, it's never worked. So what does? I think we actually need to find ourselves. Amy, I see your hand. And AJ, I know you were about to ask a question.
I just have a quick one. Do you ever have you ever been called an anti-Semite for what you just said? Because we've got this thing in this country where if you criticize Israel, you're called an anti-Semite sometimes by some people, not universally. But it stifles conversation, and it seems like it stifles looking at Israel with anything other than that completely accepting view.
That's right. Yeah. Really great, Amy. Thank you.
When that happens, what do you say? How do you respond when that?
Oh yeah, no. So there's a really powerful organization called KUFI, Christians United for Israel. The lead of that is a pastor by the name of John Hagee. He personally has come after me and my organization, calling us anti-Semitic. And where I would argue that an unequivocal, theologically entrenched or supported approach to Israel, I would say that that's not good for Israel. I would argue that our theology and politic and how it shapes this game is anti-Semitic in that it is not creating a safer world for Israel. So now that's point one. Point two, Israel has been wildly successful at feeding us the line that if we critique them, we're anti-Semitic. And the fact that the proof is in the pudding in my life in terms of the work that I'm doing with Jewish kin and Palestinian kin. So I guess my skin is now thick enough. I've been doing this work for the past 12 years, which is really a breath in terms of a 75 years long conflict, but really fiercely and intentionally, my learning curve has been very steep. My relational curve has been very steep for 12 years. My skin is now thick enough to be like, oh, I actually understand that when I say that Israel's approach is not good for Israel, I'm going to be seen as, or if I'm going to critique it at all, I'm going to be deemed by some as anti-Semitic, and that's okay with me. I disagree, but it's okay with me so long as I can then have a follow-up conversation about what anti-Semitism means and where were you fed that, and how do we collectively move. Like, to critique is not to say I'm anti. The other thing I'm going to say though is that my juice, my energy, I'm not going to do anything to change Israel and Palestine. Israel and Palestine is going to find their way because they find themselves around tables. Now, I think that we have a role to play around that table as well. My work is with U.S. American Christians who I think endorse violence for fear of being seen as anti-Semitic. I actually want to grow our courage, both in terms of moving beyond Islamophobic and anti-Semitic, and understanding like what actually would be anti-Semitic. And let's be careful of that. What actually would be Islamophobic, and let's be careful of that, you know. So yeah, I guess that, Amy, that's how I'd interact with that. And I think those of us, and the last thing I think I would say is many of us as American Christians, we've been socialized into a pro-Israel approach, and from an early age, especially those of us who witnessed 48 or the 6 Days War, you know, like we see all of this happening, and we've been told this is all miracle, this is all prophecy. To be pro-Israel is to be on the side of God. When you begin to wake up to the realities of what's happening, oftentimes what happens is you swing from pro-Israeli to pro-Palestinian. And we do so in a way that's not super thoughtful. And so we start to spout off in ways that actually probably are anti-Semitic. I think many of us have maybe been conditioned to pro-Palestinian is a new, better destination. And both my Israeli and Palestinian kin would say, do not become pro one and anti other, and don't swing this way, because all you're doing is importing our violence into your churches. The journey that we have to take, and this is the work that Global Immersion is doing, is for many of us who have been socialized into a pro-Israeli posture and approach, part of the journey might involve moving to sympathetic to Palestinian, not as a destination, but as a part of the journey. The work that we have to do is move to pro-human. I am pro-Israeli and I am pro-Palestinian, and that means some stuff to me and to those that we're working with. That is very practical. It's very tangible. It's not just good intentions toward these people. To be pro-Israel is to be adamantly against this unchecked, disproportionate violence that's sweeping in on Gaza right now. We should be wildly critical of it, right? And to be pro-Palestinian is not to condone what happened on October the 7th. It's tragic. It's heinous, right? But what I would argue is that we need to understand the kids who are holding the guns and the pain that they've experienced and the ideology that they're being fed in order to fight a war that will cost everyone. No one will win.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to jump in there because my question was about the pro-human stance, and you just kind of hit on that a little bit. But what I'm wondering about, especially as American Christians, is, you know, how do we take that pro-human stance, and like what does peacemaking look like? And I particularly am thinking about Advent coming up, you know, and we have a Sunday of peace, and we have, you know, Jesus coming into the world. Like, how do we as Christians, you know, kind of incorporate this into our theologies and our worship and our practice? And so it's not just, oh, we lit a candle for peace in Advent, you know, but how does this become real for some of us?
Yeah. So good, AJ. Thanks. I mean, one of the reasons I love the Advent season as a peacemaker is because I think it helps us see God's commitment to waging peace, not through military overthrow or political power, but through vulnerable self-sacrifice. I think we see God actually laying down power in order to usher in a more beautiful world. And so when I think about incarnation, I think about what it actually takes to usher in the world that we're dreaming of from within the world that we've inherited. What does it look like? It looks like we redeploy power. We redeploy the privilege that we have. We immerse into the radical center of broken stories, not to win, but to heal, transform. When I think about what does it mean that Jesus was the Prince of Peace, it meant that he he walked slowly toward relationship at the pace of trust. He chilled with all of the wrong people. He spoke truth to power and change to society. But when he was doing that, he was talking to the religious power brokers. He wasn't talking to, he wasn't even talking to imperial like Roman leaders. He was inviting folk into a careful self-interrogation of the theology that they've inherited, and not just with words. Jesus would like put on display the hopeful alternative. He would actually demonstrate what it means to see the humanity, dignity, and image of God in others, irritants and enemies. Jesus demonstrated what it means to immerse into the radical center of pain with compassion and courage. Jesus demonstrated what it means to repurpose resources and the tools that were in his and other people's hands to contend for the flourishing of people who had been marginalized by power's abuse, right? Like this, the good news of Christmas and of Advent is that peace was coming to reside in our planet, but it would be costly. Like the reason God chose a bloodline to begin with is because if restoration was going to cost blood, he needed a bloodline. Like Jesus entered into the world, which would then predispose that restoration would be costly. And so I think we have to maybe this Advent, get out of the idea that we're going to establish peace by winning and we're going to leave unscathed. It doesn't go well for the peacemakers. Right? So to follow Jesus in the way of incarnation looks like following Jesus into costly solidarity, into creative love, into redistributing and redeploying power and resources in unique collaborations that actually begin to unmake broken things and remake beautiful things, right? And that's not just in the way that we think, that's in the way that we show up on a day-to-day basis, And so there's a journey that we have to take as Jesus people, especially in the West, because I think many of us have been socialized into a religion that dominates, but we've been invited into a faith that restores. And so the journey from a religion that dominates to a faith that restores, it's a perilous pilgrimage and absolutely worth our lives. And that's the work that Global Immersion is doing, is we're companioning congregations and leaders on this journey because the world needs us to participate into the revolution that we've been invited into, because this story has been bad news for far too long. There's a better story. My hope is that we can awaken to it a little bit more this Advent.
This is a process question. When you visualize some kind of a negotiated settlement in the future between these two sides, is it ever possible to visualize the removal of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank as part of that compromise?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the presence of the settlement is a major obstacle for a just and lasting peace, and therefore that's been one of the strategies to as rapidly populate those settlements as possible. As a matter of fact, right now, the most aggressive settlement development is happening in East Jerusalem to really choke off the West Bank from Jerusalem and to interrupt the travel and the relationships between the Palestinian citizens of Israel that live in East Jerusalem and their family in the West Bank. And so the word for that over there is facts on the ground. So you're trying to create as many obstacles for a two-state solution, let's say, as possible. I don't know anymore what I think about one state or two state or whatever it is. I find it implausible in the moment to imagine Israel's government now moving a million plus Israeli settlers out of Palestinian territory. I just don't think that would be I think that would be a showstopper in terms of peace negotiations. I think instead the only way to really think about this is either a fully representative one state reality, or if you have two states, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, the Israelis who live in the Palestinian state would submit to the government of that space, and the Palestinians who live in the Israeli space would submit to the government of that space. It's very hard to imagine at the moment, truthfully, so let's continue to watch how that story unfolds. I hope that many of my colleagues in the region right now are saying their prayer right now is that the dawn breaks after the deepest darkness. And so I think they see this as the deepest darkness. The problem is the reconcilers, the peacemakers, are being killed, kidnapped, imprisoned, and defunded right now. So the hope dealers, the people who are most equipped to awaken the imaginations of society to healing and to hope and to a way forward, are being systematically, and this is Israelis and Palestinians, are being killed, imprisoned, and defunded. So that doesn't bode well for the future if the healers are being eliminated. Yeah, good. Last question, Dave. Then if it's okay, I got a jet. I want to offer just one final devotional word before I go, but hit me with one more question, Dave, non-violently, of course.
You've talked about the unpopularity of Netanyahu. Is there a better leader that could help move the whole situation forward toward a peaceful solution in Israel to replace Netanyahu, and who would that be?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I don't know who. I think the same is true in our own country. I think some of the best leaders who actually could lead with a vision aren't politicians. They don't fancy themselves as such. So yeah, absolutely. These are people. I think the people to lead in the future are leaders who are conflict competent leaders who know how to reach for the hands of one another rather than power and have a proven track record of doing that. It's just hard in a political system where politicians reach for power and they accumulate and preserve power. That's what they do. And they even in our own country, I don't think we're seeing a representative government. I think our democracy is very fragile at the minute because power is the priority rather than the flourishing of our communities. So we need to be looking around. I think the whole game is probably a bit slanted, but we need to be looking around for the leaders who are reaching for the hands of one another rather than power. We need to be following their lead right now. And I would argue, especially the leaders who are doing that and have a proven track record of doing that from within communities who have been marginalized by power's abuse. I think suffering has forged in them a particular way of imagining not only solutions, but pathways to those solutions that someone like me, who has been socialized into a lot of privilege and certainty and success, my imagination is calcified. So like, I think that the future that we're dreaming of, our leaders will look and sound different. And it's going to take a lot more people like you and I getting behind them and not only supporting, but keeping them accountable to continuing to reach for the hands of one another. So if it'd be okay, just a devotional thought for us, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Leslie and AJ. I'm struck in this moment when I'm talking with American Christians by the moment in Mark 10 when Jesus is on his way into Jericho, and there's a blind beggar there by the name of Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus in this passage is the only blind person that is distinguished as such. Yet he's the only one that's crystal clear on who Jesus is. And I love in that passage, blind Bartimaeus understands that a person who can fundamentally change his reality is in his presence. And so he does what people who have been marginalized by injustice do. He got as loud as he could possibly. He needed to be noticed. So he screams out, "David, son of," or Jesus, or Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And all the people are like, "Bro, like, settle down. He's not here to hang with blind beggars." And but Bartimaeus is undeterred. "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." He's just screaming. You can imagine how disruptive and how uncomfortable that is for people who are trying to welcome Jesus into their city and such. Mark writes that then Jesus sees Bartimaeus, probably sees his humanity, his dignity, the image of God in him, sees his pain, sees his plight. And what he sees causes him to stop dead in his tracks, because Bartimaeus is now the most important thing in the world to him. And Jesus draws near him. Jesus immerses into the radical center of this man's pain, his desperation. And listen to what Jesus does. When Jesus immerses into Bartimaeus's circle. Jesus does so with a question. Now, if you've ever interacted with someone who is physically blind, 9.9 times out of 10, you can tell that they're physically blind. So Jesus walks up, and Jesus could have just been like, clearly this dude wants to see, and just heals the guy's eyes. But when Jesus immerses into his story, he does so with a question. He says, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus says, I want to see. And then Jesus heals his sight. And then the story goes on that that Bartimaeus followed Jesus into Jericho. But I like to imagine if Bartimaeus, who has been blind his entire life, can finally see, I don't imagine him like kind of straggling behind. I imagine him like backflipping in the front, like leading this Jesus into the city. Like, this man just fundamentally changed my life, and I think he can change yours as well. And as the story unfolds, we kind of lose sight of Bartimaeus, but I imagine Bartimaeus in the front being like, can you believe what's happening, you know? And leads Jesus to a sycamore tree where there's another dude, not just because of his physical stature, but because of the systems and the structures that he's a part of. His vision is calloused. He can't see. And Jesus draws near him, sees his humanity, dignity, and image of God, immerses into the radical center of his story, shares a table, and as a result, another blind guy who couldn't see now can see. I want to offer that as an invitation for us, that my vision, my perspective is not 2020. The way that I've been socialized to understand what's going on, I'm calloused. And so do I acknowledge that I am never fully right and always partially wrong, and I need Jesus to continue to heal my sight? Or do I want to continue to stand by with calluses in my eyes? I think that's the invitation for Western Christians right now. The pores of our souls are open a little bit. My hope is that we, like blind Bartimaeus, would say, Jesus, I want to see, heal my sight. And I hope moments like these and a whole bunch more can contribute to us seeing more accurately. So thank you for hosting me, and thank you for leaning in, and let's keep doing it together for the sake of the world.
Amen. Thank you, Jer, so much for being here with us. We really, really appreciate your insights and your wisdom and sharing with us. I just wanted to lift up a couple of administration things. And maybe, Jer, if you have time, you want to speak to the interviews that you've been doing to point people to that?
Sure thing. Yeah. I'll point to two things. One, our organization is really committed to amplifying the voices of the Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers who are in the trenches of this war. And so we're hosting what we're just simply calling a virtual immersion, where on a weekly basis, we're trying to get between 1 and 2 live conversations we're hosting those on our Instagram page. So if you're on Instagram, follow @Global Immerse, and maybe AJ, you can pop that into the comment thread, @Global Immerse. So you can interact live with us as we're hosting these conversations with Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers. If you're not on Instagram, we're also hosting those recordings of those videos on our YouTube channel. So you can find Global Immersion on YouTube and view those. And we're hosting the audio of those conversations on our podcast called the Everyday Peacemaking Podcast. So as long as you have access to some kind of technology, you can listen in. And I think that the stories and the perspectives of our Israelis and Palestinians, that's what Jesus over the last 12 years has been using to heal my sight. And so that's what we're trying to offer. So Instagram, you can find us @Global Immerse. YouTube channel, you can find Global Immersion on YouTube. Just search for Global Immersion. Or our website is globalimmerse.org, globalimmerse.org, where you can access our podcast and listen in on those conversations. I would really encourage you right now, if you're new to Global Immersion, to subscribe. You can do that at Global Immerse as well. Subscribe, because just the way right now that we're keeping you up to speed and in the loop in terms of what's happening geopolitically, who are we listening to right now, and how do you actually get access to these folks and to their resources. We're just in a really measured and sustainable way putting these resources into your hands, so that we can all be on the journey together. So you can subscribe to Global Immersion's information right there on globalimmerse.org. The last thing that I would say is that you've heard me now repeat see, immerse, contend, and the fourth practice is restore a few times now, especially in what I just did with Bartimaeus. That's our everyday peacemaking framework. So we're not an Israel-Palestine organization. We're a peacemaking training organization. We've built a 4-practice framework for everyday peacemaking, those 4 practices being see, immerse, contend, restore. How do we become people who see more accurately, immerse more courageously, and contend more creatively? Because when we do, we find ourselves joining God in the work of restoration. As AJ mentioned in the very beginning, we wrote a book on that called Mending the Divides, Creative Love in a Conflicted World. And it lays out those 4 practices in really the unfolding story of God. Like, God has ever been a peacemaker. Ever since we reached for the fruit of power and shattered shalom, God has been a peacemaker who has been putting things back together. And so we pull those 4 practices directly out of the meta narrative of God. And you'll see that, and you'll kind of see how this is playing out in communities all around the country. So I encourage you to grab a copy of Mending the Divides. It's a really important primer, I think, for those of us who are Christian on a journey toward peacemaking as a way in which we express our faith. So there's some resources for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those. And also, we have been able to record this. Thank you, Jer, for allowing us to do that. So if you would like a copy of the recording to just even listen to again and pick up some more wisdom, I'm sure you probably either know how to contact me or how to contact Leslie. And we are happy to share that recording with you. So I think that is all that I had. Anything else from you, Leslie, or?
I know there were some of you who knew of people who wanted to be here today but couldn't be. And so if you do know of those folks, please share our emails, one or the other or both, to ask for the recording. If your members are on the distribution list at my church or at AJ's, you'll probably get that information on how to get the recording link sent out. But if you know people who are connected to our 2 churches, then definitely share our emails and contact information, and we'll get the link out. So.
And all right. Well, thank you again all for being here, and we continue to pray for peace, for seeing, for restoration. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all so much for
Thank
being
you,
here.
Jer. Thank you. So God bless.